good. Today we're talking with, we're going to hear from Sam Randall, who I met when I'm still here in Colorado, but I met when I first came here. I started working in Collegiate Recovery, and Sam had worked at University of Colorado Boulder for a few years before that, and has just been a guiding light of wisdom and just almost like a spiritual mentor for me in Collegiate Recovery. We've only spoken a handful of times, but every time it just kind of blows me away and gives me so much. So we wanted to bring her in and let her speak with all of you today. So yeah, I'm gonna turn it over to Sam and let's have some fun.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dylan, very much. And it's great to be here. I was working in Collegiate Recovery at CU Boulder when Safe Campuses got started. And so it's been just very cool to see the growth of the SAFE project and all the different dimensions and what it's doing for Collegiate Recovery in particular. I have this funny thing happening right now where I can't see any of you, but I can see my screen, and I'm hoping you can see it and you can see me.
See you.
Okay, good. I just wanted to check. So, one moment. Let's make sure I can forward. There we go. So yes, those that I have not met, my name is Sam Randall, and former program manager at the CU Collegiate Recovery Center at CU Boulder. I was involved at the very beginning when we founded it in 2013 and all the way up through 2019. And when I stepped out and actually turned it over to the current program manager is a graduate of our CRC. So some really wonderful lineage starting to happen with a lot of our programs. I like to, whenever I talk publicly, I often open with, so my name is Sam, and I am a recovering human being. I'm recovering from the condition of being human. And how many of you find it hard to be human? I certainly do and have, and at times it became a real crisis for me. And I know that for many of our students and those in recovery, kind of facing that and walking through that to find our way to recovery is really what it's all about, whatever form that may take. And that's a little bit of what we're going to talk about tonight. See if I can, looks like I can't use my buttons. There we go. So just a little overview for this evening's presentation. And I intentionally kind of thought of it as being just a little bit more informal eventually. So I hope that we can have a discussion, because I feel like the topic that we're going to be talking about tonight is a very, very prevalent topic in many, many communities. And so I'm looking forward to getting to the discussion part. But we'll start with just talking generally. I'll share about my experience with creating what we think of as an empowered community that supports diversity in recovery. And specifically, I'll be using the CU CRC as an example, and especially the first 2 years, because I know that many are involved in the early startup of the CRC, and I thought that might be helpful to talk about how that evolved into such a diverse community with many, many pathways of recovery. And we'll share a little bit also about some of the community dynamics that come up around that, and really how we do support such a diverse community. And fundamentally, the third bullet point on here, oh, I've got them all numbered 3. Look at that. Leading with the heart. So that's kind of we call it at CU, we called it the secret sauce. So I'm going to share with you the ingredients of the secret sauce. And then we'll open it up for discussion and hearing some of your experiences and any questions you may have. So with this topic, creating empowered spaces for recovery, it seemed important to start with the basics, which is, well, what does empowered mean? That's a word that's used a lot and almost, kind of trends onto the buzzword of throw that in and you're hitting the marks of something that student affairs likes to hear. But what do we really mean by empowered? I think it's very important to touch on that. So this is a definition from Merriam-Webster, that empowered is having the knowledge, confidence, means, or ability to do things or make decisions for oneself. And I really like this definition because it touches on what I see to be kind of the 4 areas that collegiate recovery leaders and mentors and staff are often involved in, which is helping people to gain and grow in their knowledge, in their confidence, in their means, and in their abilities. So that part of empowered. And then the second really basic thing is, well, what is recovery? So when we talk about creating empowered spaces for recovery, it seems important to also touch on what do we mean when we say recovery? And some of you might be familiar with or have done a lot of work or education around different pathways of recovery and the different principles of recovery. There are many different models around. And here's a couple that I know are out there. The collaborative recovery model. Recovery is a unique and personal journey towards hope, meaning, identity, and responsibility for self. And then the National Recovery Science Research Collaborative definition from 2017. Recovery is an intentional, dynamic, and relational process involving sustained efforts to improve multiple aspects of wellness, which may vary, right, by individual, social, and experiential contexts. At the CUCRC, we used in a lot of our materials and in conversations with students, the SAMHSA's definition, working definition of recovery, which is a process of change through which individuals can improve their health and wellness and strive to reach their full potential. And we'll come back to these definitions a little bit later, but I wanted to just lay the groundwork for the basics with that and kind of touch on that. If we're talking about empowered spaces for recovery, we're really talking about giving people the knowledge, confidence, means, and ability to do or make decisions for themselves about their recovery. So really, we're talking about choice here. I had the benefit, being in Colorado, of being invited to be on a number of panels by a young woman who identified in recovery. And when she first started her path of recovery, as many, there was kind of one path that was presented to her, and it was, well, either do that or you're going to die. And that was a really hard thing for her to hear. And she took it on herself to launch an initiative just to learn more about, what are the paths of recovery. And when we talk about that, I'm going to focus a lot on mutual aid dimensions of recovery, because a lot of collegiate recovery programs are peer-based. So peer-to-peer often are mutual aid pathways. And then we'll also talk a little bit about all of the many different approaches that support recovery that are beyond just mutual aid recovery. So I'm just curious, and if, again, I can't see y'all, but if you would like to put in the chat, pathways of recovery, and we're specifically talking here about mutual aid recovery, recovery communities, recovery fellowships, recovery programs that are free and available to anyone, that is a pathway of recovery. And if you'd like to kind of pop those in the chat, be interesting to see what people's awareness is about that. And then I'll show you in the next slide some of the ones that at the CRC, we had materials for all of these programs, and then a few more that aren't even listed here. So on the right, you have 12-step programs of recovery. And if you go to Wikipedia for 12-step, you will see the whole range of all the different A's, as we call them, and everything from variations on different substances to variations around codependency, adult children of alcoholics. ITAA is Internet Technology Addiction Anonymous. WA is Workaholics Anonymous. So there's the 12-step programs. There's the Recovery Dharma, Refuge Recovery programs, Women in Sobriety, Smart Recovery, Life Ring, 12-step empowerment model, and many others that have grown, especially over the last 10 to 20 years. There's just been a tremendous growth of choice and option in a peer-based lived experience program of recovery with different approaches and things that are happening within each. And then the two in the middle, I want to acknowledge that the natural recovery, which is kind of defined as like basically someone realizes, hey, I'm not doing well, and I think I'd like to change some things in my life, and they're able to make those changes and find their way to greater health and well-being kind of on their own. Often we still find that there's someone or something in their life that is supporting that, but we might term that more natural recovery. And then moderation management there are many people who do practice moderation as a form of recovery, and moderation management, if you're not familiar with it, is an actual program that has very specific guidelines for engaging in a pathway of moderation, specifically around alcohol. That's the focus of that program. Many people, when I first learned about it, I found out that it was not well known, and that actually there's some wonderful guidance in there, and it can be effective for those who want to at least explore a path of moderation. And so I put all these up here to just share with you, if you weren't familiar with the wide range of choice in mutual aid recovery pathways. This is a selection of some of them. And at our center at CU, and I personally believe that as our job as leaders or mentors or staff in a collegiate recovery program, even if there are specific meetings that are offered within the campus environment, having materials about all of these programs, I found to be incredibly helpful to students, particularly even if they didn't check them all out, but just like, oh, wow, this is like a thing. Look at all of these options. It suddenly opens up a possibility that maybe they didn't think was there. And I highly recommend, as staff or student leaders, learning about the programs and learning how they function, what's the structure, so that if a student says, hey, I want to go check out Women in Sobriety, if you have one in your area, or if you don't, if there's online meetings, that you are informed and can share that with someone of like, well, here's what I understand about that might help to guide them as they go to check it out. And then what's not on this slide, but I do want to mention, are just all of the other different approaches to supporting recovery. So, of course, within a collegiate recovery program, a major area of that is pro-social events and activities. So the social connection, therapy, therapeutic work, whether that's psychotherapy or other therapeutic processes, treatment through medication, mind-body practices, connection with nature. In Colorado, that's probably high on the list for many of us here as being one of the primary sources of support for our recovery. And then spiritual practices. So I wanted to share with you how at the CU Collegiate Recovery Center we started supporting all of these multiple pathways of recovery. I think it might be helpful to understand that as a little bit of a timeline. And we'll start in 2013 with what was on campus at the time at CU Boulder when the center started. And these slides that I'm going to share, this next set, they actually come from a presentation that I did when I was still working at CU at one of the National Collegiate Recovery Conferences. And the slides I found to be still incredibly relevant for today for telling the story. And also I will share, this is not redundant, because when I went to do the presentation, something went wrong with the tech and they couldn't get our slides pulled up. And so I did the whole presentation without slides. And so I actually feel somewhat quite joyful that I'm gonna be able to share these slides with you today. At the time we were thinking about, there was a lot of discussion of, well, how are you going to support students in recovery? It has to look like this, or yeah, those students they probably wouldn't be able to relate to this. And Danny Conroy and I, who's the other founder, just kept talking about, why does it have to be so limited? Why can't we just keep building this boat bigger? So we had this concept of building a bigger lifeboat. As far as I saw it, if somebody wanted to get in the boat of recovery, get in the boat. Like, just get in, and we'll figure out how best that boat might be able to serve you. So when we started at CU, there was already this group on campus that one of the counselors in our counseling and psychiatric services program had been facilitating. There was an informal Friday afternoon meetup for any students who were curious about contemplating or committed to a sober lifestyle. And notice it doesn't have the word recovery in it, that it was kept fairly broad, and about half the students were students who identified on a path of recovery and were abstinent from substances. And then the other half were students who were choosing a sober lifestyle for a variety of different reasons. And that group was called Oasis. And when we opened the center, that was one of the first groups to start meeting in the center. So that's our first program in the lifeboat, if you will. And then we had other students, once the space was open and available and we had this dedicated student lounge and meeting space, there were students who were on a 12-step path of recovery who said, gosh, it would be amazing to have a 12-step meeting on campus and I could just pop over in between classes. We said, the space is here, you're welcome to start one. And so an AA meeting got started, and that was at noon on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and that became a really strong meeting for a long time. By fall of 2014, this is the next year, we found that there were students who were interested in recovery, but maybe were wanting to just talk about things more generally about being a student in recovery. And that's when we founded what we call recovery talks, which in some of your experiences, you might think of as like an all recovery or an open recovery meeting, non-denominational, more of a general format. There really wasn't any history or tradition to it because it was just an informal open discussion about maybe what was going on in their life. So that was recovery talks. And that became an anchor and is still an anchor on campus today for the students. Another student started a Narcotics Anonymous meeting, and then we had this student club that got founded by a bunch of the students called the Sober Social Club, and they started holding sober tailgates and things like that. So this was in year 2. We had a few different options available to students in different formats and supporting more of the social connection as well. Phoenix Multisport, which again in Colorado, we were very fortunate that they were founded here. And so before they did their nationwide launch, there were a lot of programs in the Boulder and Denver area that students could participate in. Phoenix Multisport is now they're called just the Phoenix. It's a sober active community that hosts a lot of different active programs. I think many of you might be familiar with them now that they're nationwide. Someone else started an Al-Anon meeting, and then a student who was in recovery around technology use started an internet technology addiction anonymous meeting on Thursdays. And then, see if I can go. We also had growing at the same time things like game night and bowling and yoga. So we're really touching on this wider range of supports for people in recovery around mind, body, and social dynamics. And with this, we were partnering quite a bit at this point with counseling and psychiatric services for the clinical needs that our students might have. So those were just the first 2 years. As you can see, we went from one program to even just here, we're showing 10 programs of different sorts and variety. Since then, other programs were added. There was a great interest in refuge recovery as that started to grow, which on our campus, when Recovery Dharma was kind of the offshoot of that, and the meeting that was on campus that ended up changing to a Recovery Dharma meeting. More recovery talks were added over time that were more kind of population specific. So on campus now, there's a queer talks, which is for people who identify as queer in recovery. And there's also a group called FEM, which was for FEM-identified folks in recovery. So that recovery talks model became a really nice mutable model for people. And this idea of what I call recovering human beings became kind of a core principle within the community that everybody could identify around. So one of the challenges with so many different pathways of recovery, and that's both pathways as in the actual program of recovery someone might be engaged with, but also just pathways of what am I recovering from? So at this point, we had a pretty wide range of people who were in substance use recovery, but also had other dimensions of their life that they identified in recovery. And then those who never had an issue with substances, but for sure came in because they were struggling with their social anxiety or generalized anxiety or post-traumatic stress, all kinds of reasons that someone might realize, hey, I think I need some more support. And some people came because they were living a sober lifestyle and they were attracted to a sober community. And then once they got involved with the community, they realized, oh, part of what was going on for me and why this community was attractive to me was because I was struggling emotionally or otherwise. And so a lot of those students started identifying as being in emotional recovery, and they benefited greatly from acknowledging that and exploring what recovery would look like for them. And the students came up with, they even had a little slogan, that, which I think they're still using today, which is come for the sobriety, stay for the recovery. And became quite a well-rounded community that looked at the deeper roots of we are all recovering human beings. Some of the benefits of this approach in a community are, for sure, attracting and growing a much larger student base. The number one, to me, benefit of this approach is helping more students find their way to well-being, even if substances aren't an issue. And even if they are an issue, helping more students, because it's a more open door and diverse approach where the students are really empowered to find what works for them. The students themselves benefit from the diversity. Really saw a lot of students who learned about other people's paths of recovery that maybe they would not have if it was a more singular model of recovery program that was available to them. And then, of course, increased visibility and outreach with the growing group, and a lot more creativity around how the community functioned, partly because that was out of necessity. With a more diverse community, you are by nature going to be challenged to explore how to grow and how to keep a healthy community over time. So that brings me to part two of this, which is, well, how do I support such a diverse community? I often think this is one of the reasons why people don't go for this type of diversity, is because it, as you can imagine, it can already be like, well, gosh, how are the students going to be able to relate to each other? That's one of the common things that would come up. And it's a little more challenging because it's less predictable, right? Offering more choice does involve a more organic process rather than just, here, go do this and you're going to get better. So there can be some uncertainty. So I thought what might be helpful is actually to go back to this definition: recovery, a process of change through which individuals can improve their health and wellness, and talk about this idea of this process. What is this process of recovery? And this is something that I would, let me back up a little bit. I got really curious about what was happening when I saw students recover, and in my own recovery. It's like, what is working here? And is there something in common when I see students that develop what we call strong recovery? Is there something happening that is actually in common no matter what pathway someone might be engaged in? And I went back to what many people, I think, are largely on board with, what we know to be these different dimensions that are involved in a process of recovery. And so biological, psychological, and social. And if we think about the biological just on its own, how do I address what might be going on literally in my biology, that whether that's through substance use or through a process addiction, or through other aspects that might have to do with nervous system being dysregulated through trauma experiences or other roots of mental health issues or addiction. So what I found is that everyone who has strong recovery in some form is attending to this biological dimension. So these are practices or treatments that assist the brain and nervous system in healing and developing new pathways. And this can be everything from, so it could be biologically, I'm not going to use a certain substance so that I can allow my brain and system to heal. And then once I am doing better and healthy, maybe I can explore using that substance again. Maybe I can't. Maybe it's something that actually I won't be able to. But that would be one example of biological. So when we talk about abstinence-based recovery, this is what it's attending to, is literally the biological dimension. Well, it's also functioning, as we know, in the psychological dimensions and social dimensions too. But when I would talk with students about why abstinence made sense for some people, it's like, let's let your brain heal. Right now, it's wired to use. And what would happen if you allow those pathways to quiet down and form new pathways? And then you can kind of see what happens. And we found a lot of people in natural recovery and where this works. Other things might be just other practices or treatments that are working on that nervous system. So then the next dimension, psychological, processes for exploring relationship with self and others through personal reflection or in a therapeutic relationship to develop safety, healing, and growth. So this is where therapy comes in often. But this also could be your own personal reflection. In 12-step, this is the steps. This is the inventory. This is reflection that can be done with oneself. At the same time, you might be engaging in other processes too. In Recovery Dharma, this is, they do an inventory in there as well that's around the Eightfold Path and just really exploring psychologically how I'm showing up. And then the third dimension is the social dimension, opportunities to experience healthy, supportive connection with others and to cultivate meaning and purpose. And often spiritual dimension kind of overlaps with this. I didn't put that on there as its own dimension here, but we know that that cultivation of meaning and purpose can be really significant for people on a path of recovery. So these three dimensions can be a really good touchstone for checking in about how someone is engaging in their recovery. And I would say they can sometimes start to become predictors. So Recovery Coaching 101, I say one of the most important open questions you can ask is, what does your recovery look like? So this is really putting the person front and center and saying, well, I want to know what your recovery looks like. It's not my recovery, it's yours, right? So with these three dimensions in mind, I would propose that an even further, more specific question is, what does your recovery look like for each of these dimensions? Because it's very easy to answer, what does your recovery look like? It's like, well, I go to these meetings, or I like to work out, and I check in with a friend, and I'm seeing my therapist, right? So those are kind of the core activities of the recovery. What this model does is it helps us to look at where are those activities functioning, and you can start to think about it. And for some people, they might be functioning and engaging quite a bit within one area, but maybe not in the other areas. So this is can be a really critical turning point for someone who's in a role as a mentor or recovery coach, to be able to say, well, great, you got the social thing going on. You've gotten really connected with the community. How are you developing psychologically? How are you developing biologically, just within your nervous system and your body mind? Now, that said, this is not about a prescription of you have to do something in each. Sometimes those social things are helping with the psychological or even the biological, because there might be some activities that you're engaging in. So this isn't necessarily about what you do in one means you're not doing the others, but by using these three lenses, it can be helpful to see that someone's pathway of recovery, which may not look like yours or may not be the one that you think is going to be the most successful. What I found in 7 years working collegiate recovery with a very, very unique framework where we get to be with students, in some cases 4 or 5 years, we get to really see what recovery looks like over time. I found that if they were engaging in some form in all three of these, they tended to do really well. It almost became a predictor of they're going to do well. They are continuing to deepen and heal and grow. So, but part of why this model is helpful is because it also frees you up from it being any one particular pathway. So when I'm talking with a student and they're like, well, I don't think I want to do that, I'm not sure what to do, then I can introduce this model and go, let's talk about what would support you socially, psychologically, or biologically. And if you can kind of put something in place for all three of those, no matter how small, it could be a really small action, they tend to start to get better. So coming back to this question of how do I support such a diverse community, my hope is, first of all, that maybe there's something about this type of diversity that feels appealing and that you're interested in. How might I do this? The bigger question then is, well, what could possibly go wrong? It sounds great, right? Yes, I support empowerment. I support choice. Well, I'm going to tell you a few of the things that we learned along the way. Some of the challenges that we faced, especially in those early years, different needs, different pathways, all these different programs and approaches, it's a lot to manage. It required a lot for me to learn all the different programs and start to be able to support students in talking about that. It challenged me to shift my thinking that a certain way was the way. Sometimes difficult to build a cohesive culture. That's probably one of the bigger challenges. As certain students were going to certain kinds of recovery meetings, the others weren't building those same bonds. And at times, depending on the personal dynamic, sometimes there could be some conflict coming up or divisiveness, especially when there was judgment. Risks of community conflict then come out of that, right? These natural social divisions and opinions about whose recovery is real recovery. This is a big conversation going on for a long time. Natural tendency to focus on difference. The other aspect is just, it's open door and we didn't have any membership required. People were coming in with all kinds of different reasons that they were there for recovery. And sometimes that led to some challenges just around unity and investment and leadership. The students took longer to build that sense of common purpose. And that's where the recovering human being came out of. So that once they realized, oh, we are all recovering human beings, then you had that sense of identity, regardless of fellowship or community. And with there was quite a lot of focus on students who were sober, living a sober lifestyle, but not necessarily identifying in recovery. And there was some concern that that might confuse the mission. So some of the things that happened at the time, I'll share kind of two of the biggest challenges. One is for sure around culture and language. So students just not understanding each other and coming from completely different experiences. I'll share one example, which was we had a student who lived a sober lifestyle and he used the lounge a lot in order to study. And then other students obviously on a path of recovery, and they're all sitting around a table. And this one student had an assignment I'm trying to remember what the actual assignment was. It sort of looking at morality and lifestyle choice and things like that. And I heard him begin to talk about what he was working on for his assignment and writing about, and he's sharing about this openly in the lounge, was the morality of using heroin. And he's talking quite openly about this being a moral choice and all of this. And of course, he's in a room with people who are in recovery from heroin use. And I could feel the alarm bells going off in the room. And cultural differences will arise with a diverse community like that. And it requires more of us to show up and do some education with the students and help them to learn from each other about why certain conversations might be challenging for others. I'd say that was probably the largest area of my work as a staff member over years, was around that. And then the other main challenge we had was kind of a pretty strong bias over time. Some of the 12-step meetings ended up moving off campus, or for other reasons, it's hard to have parking on campus, and so they didn't thrive. But many of our students were still engaging in 12-step fellowship off campus. And there became a little bit of a story around that the CRC was, I'll share openly, the phrase they used was recovery light, and that the real recovery was happening in the rooms, particularly the rooms of 12-step. And my recovery was 12-step based in many years, and I've sponsored people, and I find it to be an incredibly powerful pathway of recovery. But it was difficult to realize that there was this perception that folks who were part of the CRC did not have real recovery. And so we had a lot of conversations then, and one of the things that was interesting was, I think the folks who were very active in the 12-step community over time started to see students who came into the CRC first and maybe were participating in other ways. They were exposed to students who had really, really solid recovery in a range of different programs, but they started to check them out, and they started to engage in 12-step recovery or others. And the awareness grew that actually this was a wonderful gateway for people who maybe would have never made it into any form of a recovery meeting to begin with. So that shifted, and students got used to sharing about and hearing about different pathways and learning how to share about that in a more general way so that the language wasn't lost on others who maybe didn't have that background or experience. So some of the principles that we came away with in order to hold this very diverse community. First of all, the main principle, which is what led to it being so diverse, is that everyone is welcome. But then from there, identify your resources, get creative with what you have, really getting creative with some of the challenges that we were facing and looking to other people to step in. Be flexible, willing to adapt. Every year we were kind of making it up as we went, and learning, really, really learning, having the courage to pay attention, to learn, and to adapt and adjust where needed. Really important to create safety over and over and over again. Almost every year there was some dimension that had to do with whether it's diversity of pathway of recovery or diversity of student experience, that we had to be very intentional and consistent and courageous to face, to help support a healthy community and to create safety for that community, sometimes with individual conversations that help to guide what's happening. And then mind your own ballast, what keeps the boat steady and on course, your own healthy relationships and staff, clarity of purpose and ethics, being clear on what we do and what we don't do, referring and getting out of the way. Sometimes not doing something if it felt like too much. I will say that we specifically did not start a recovery meeting or have anyone start a recovery meeting for eating disorders in the first couple of years. And part of that is wanting to make sure that that was done in a way that was as safe as possible. There's just a high amount of risk for individuals attending eating disordered recovery meetings, depending on how it's formatted. So we took some time with that and really worked with the students to visit some different mutual aid programs and explore what would feel right for our community. So not shying away from actually saying, no, I don't think we're quite ready for that is okay. So, and then in closing, that question again, like just talked about principles, how does the community kind of respond to such a diverse community as a program? But how do I lead such a diverse community? Me. And these principles of leading from the heart, I started sharing with our peer mentors in our peer mentor training, and then with the staff who took over when I stepped out. And it's kind of like the 3 dimensions of the process of recovery. These are what I call the 4 C's of leading from the heart, or another way of talking about it is like, this is what love feels like. And if you have all 4 of these going, and if you can check in regularly that these all 4 are happening, then you are showing up as best you can. So the first one is care. This will be an obvious one, right? To really show up with true care That's the number one. Second one is also fairly obvious, connection. We know that there's so much that we're learning about connection as a healing modality, and that the loss of connection is often at the root of so many of our addictions. Consistency. This to me is kind of where a team is make or break. If you can show up with care and connection consistently, then the students will trust and feel supported by you no matter what. And then the final one, I've used this word a couple of times, is courage. So this is the courage to try something new, to have a more open approach where there's a little bit more uncertainty, the courage to have the hard communication and conversation when things might go a little bit sideways, the courage to look at my own biases or resistances or fears, the courage to take care of my needs when I know that I need to, so that I can show up for others. And these become touchstones, I think, that can guide us and help us to know if we're showing up and leading with heart. And I'll close. This is kind of our motto at the center, which, as you notice, the word recovery isn't anywhere on that list, but this is what recovery looks like. So I would love to discuss and hear what you have to say, and questions or scenarios that maybe you're facing in your life around this topic of empowerment and diversity in recovery.
Wow. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, so much of what you said is just, it hits so far with things I've experienced as a professional and even as a student. Something that I'm kind of thinking about right now is almost that last point you made about courage. What does it look like to kind of hold yourself accountable as a leader to, and with the other leaders of the DU or the CUCRC, to do that? Like, how do you hold each other accountable to doing that kind of hard reflection, to be open to new ideas and be open to the things the students have to say?
Mm-hmm. For me, for sure, it's the willingness to show up again as a human being. And I want to acknowledge that a number of staff are not necessarily identifying recovery, but are allies, but that regardless, that we can all show up as human beings first. And the students many times got to experience me owning my own whatever it might be, and understanding that in the role I'm in, I'm also getting to model that for them. This is what it looks like to have courage. This is what it looks like to show up with love, and that courage is an aspect of love. And then they could start to experiment with that in their own life. So that would be the primary things, to show up as a human being, with still all the boundaries of the role and everything. But the more real that I am with the students, then the more they feel that very true heart connection.
And Eugene just asked a really, really good question in the chat, which was, yeah, with students leading, like a lot of the people who are watching this webinar are going to be students who are trying to do this while also having jobs, being in school, doing all of these things. If you could give some advice about what consistency can look like, even if your time is limited, what advice would you give?
Yeah, I think that's a very core question. And I actually work a program of Workaholics Anonymous. I'm in recovery from work addiction, and particularly in academia, there is this high level of both expectation as well as, honestly, reward for overworking. It's one of the few addictions where you're praised for it. And so I would really highly recommend, even if it's not necessarily a primary path of yours, but just exploring dimensions around that and around perfectionism. Yeah, I'm seeing some folks are like, oh yes. So many of us who are high performing struggle with that. So just know that know that you're not alone, and that there is recovery for that. If you are in need of some real support, that's a very real thing. I recommended several students and staff members to check out the principles of WA for that specific reason. And then we really grounded that into our community, that the last thing I wanted, because I was in my own recovery, I could only do this if this was done in a healthy way. And what that meant was sometimes saying, no, I actually can't. So then the part two of your question is, well, great. Okay. I understand that I need to learn how to say no, but then attendance might drop, or the community's not thriving in the way I want. And that's where some of those principles around perfectionism and workaholism and his recovery is it actually trusting? This is another core principle, trusting that what is supposed to unfold is okay, even when it doesn't look like what you think it's supposed to unfold. And this is for sure a thing. I don't know if it's still there as much because I've been out of the active work for 2 years, but in early stages of all these collegiate recovery programs growing, there was tremendous competition, and it kind of made me sick. It was like, oh, how many students do you have? And oh, so-and-so's thriving and they're doing amazing. And then, oh, ugh, we suck, and it's that just classic of you're getting someone's, highlight film, but the reality is probably much different. So be very careful about setting expectations or comparisons with other programs or with what you think your program should be. Yeah.
Yeah, especially we work with in this webinar as part of our Leadership Academy, which is mostly students in recovery and their allies looking to continue their leadership. And we often, I'm sure you've seen this, where students in recovery then become they want to be leaders, want to be productive, and that kind of makes way to other unhealthy behaviors.
Very. It's almost, it almost always happens. It's very, very common. And I don't think it's talked about enough. And especially because we're in higher ed. So they're already in a high performing environment. There's already a ton of pressure, and some of the students already have a predilection for that. And if there was anything that I would love to see happen more is discussion around performance addiction and other unhealthy behaviors. And some of it is like this, like making up for lost time sort of feeling of like, well, all of that was a disaster. And now I've got to be amazing. And I just before this, I got to go to this year's CUCRC graduation. Mm-hmm. And one of the students is a student that was like that and really struggled. He came into CU with 3 years sober. But boy, the first few years were so tough for him because of high perfectionism and performance anxiety and all kinds of things that were happening. And walking with that in multiple years of recovery, it doesn't stop because you get sober. That's just addressing the biological. Then we've got all the psychological and social dimensions to work with.
Yeah, something that I see in our students and staff, I think kind of at every level of collegiate recovery, is oftentimes the biggest barrier to creating empowered spaces is that we accidentally create fearful spaces. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you've experienced that, but if you can speak on that a little bit and what it's like to be bold and loving and caring enough to empower without letting the fear of where that could lead get too much in the way. But it's also necessary fear in some ways, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Tell me more about what you mean when you say fear.
It's either, I often will hear, even like when people are pitching a collegiate recovery program, it can be, oh, why would you put those people in a room together? So it's the stigma of the danger of people who have used drugs, people who have had these behaviors, that they are dangerous and their futures are dangerous, and they may have a recurrence of use, and therefore the dangers of that. And there's just so much protection involved. Mm-hmm. Where it's almost like I think the empowerment can not bypass the need for protection, but it's a radically more loving type of protecting of each other and protecting of the community. And so, I see a lot of folks kind of stuck in the stickiness of fear in a negative sense rather than love and try to push forward together.
Yeah. Well, to that particular form of fear, I would just be curious whether those people who have that, how much time they've spent with people who are in recovery.
Right.
Because that's what we had that happen on our campus, mainly showed up and might be for others when we had a housing program begin. Because then suddenly, you're talking about living environments, there's less control. And we experienced a ton of concern is how it was phrased about students in recovery. And in our case, we started with a floor in a dorm that was in a dorm with other students who weren't in recovery. And these were very, very open-minded, I would say, you know, well-grounded student affairs professionals. And even they were saying, yeah, we're a little concerned about whether it's going to be safe and all that. And we did two things very deliberately. One, we invited them over to our center to meet our students. And then once they met our students, they're like, oh, these students are amazing, right? Because they are. And if anything, one of the things we needed to do is a lot of education around a student in recovery has an emotional intelligence far beyond their peers because of what they've been through and because of the work they're doing psychologically and emotionally. And so it shifted from, oh, we're concerned about these students, to those housing staff became our biggest advocates. And then they started to get upset when they heard from parents who were contacting the school and had concerns. So that's the courage to lean into and not judge, because we know that those folks aren't responsible for that stigma, but they carry it, just like all bias and stigma in our communities. To lean in and have the conversations from our lived experience, but more importantly, to have them experience what recovery looks like. Because so many people know what addiction looks like, but they don't know what recovery looks or feels like. And once they experience it, they're on board.
Yeah, and I guess the other type of fear that I'm thinking of is the fear when it comes to kind of adding another meeting or adding conversations around things like a moderation management program, or including students who may have a more harm reduction focused pathway. Whatever that means for them, of like this protection of it's like the purity of sobriety. It's for some folks. Like, I'm curious, like, how have you managed that? Kind of just opening up those conversations to curiosity rather than judgment.
Yeah, I'm glad you're asking that. And it was something I wanted to for sure touch on, because that's actually a very real thing. Yeah. And our community had to navigate that over time for many different reasons. And there are some dimensions of needing to keep the community safe that are very real. Right. So there are some guidelines that we established even while we had more students coming in, some who were on a moderation pathway, some who were practicing harm reduction, some who maybe had actively or were engaged still in an active recurrence of use. So we had to develop very clear guidelines to keep the community safe, at the same time, not pushing those students away and making sure they still got the support that they needed. And what those look like for our community, and the students themselves really were a big part of this conversation, was for sure, the space itself is a sober space. Our activities are sober activities. If someone is moderating use or has had a recent use, we ask that they not come to something that is community-based that day, but they are welcome to meet with a staff person individually. And then we had a dedicated meeting that was set up for students that wanted to talk about their moderation, because there are some risks and challenges in having a student talk about moderating substances with other students in the same meeting, where that would be very, very risky for them. So we established another recovery talks that was around moderation for those students. And that, because they need to talk about their path of recovery, but in a way that's not going to cause harm to others. So it's sort of like the first do no harm model, but it doesn't mean you can't do it. You just have to figure out, how do we do it without causing harm to others? And that, honestly, that worked really, really well. And I think it, in fact, I know it does. And I know students who were very embedded in an abstinence-based recovery program for a number of years, who have now returned to moderate, healthy, safe use. And part of why I think it's healthy and safe for them is because they were able to talk about what that might look like, rather than be shunned or stigmatized.
That's amazing. Something that I'm wondering about kind of practically, knowing that, seeing the kind of beautiful community you were speaking of, obviously I've been inside the CUCRC. It's a beautiful place every time you step into it. Empowering, energetic, tight-knit spaces like that can be magnetic to some students and can be intimidating to others, and sometimes both, right? What was it like to balance that? And like, what are some of the things that our students can put in place to make sure that the meetings feel welcome to students who are still feeling a little bit like they're on the outside?
Yeah, and not overwhelming. It's a
Right.
super interesting situation that I didn't anticipate at first, but we had it happen. And I'll tell you, actually, in our first year, I had a student who I was assisting in getting to treatment. She was a student living in a dorm on campus freshman year and had been connected with us and was in the middle of, frankly, detoxing off the substances she'd been using. She was going to be on campus for maybe another couple of weeks, and at that point the suggestion was come to the center, hang out, just gives you a safe place to be. And then we were doing some one-on-one work with her, and she was the first one, so I was lucky, as in my first year, where I got the very direct feedback from her that it was hard for her to be in the center because everybody was so happy. She said it just like that. And I was like, oh, yeah. Like, it didn't even occur to me, but yeah, it can be really hard when someone is struggling and hurting to be around people who are just super happy. No matter how loving and warm and accepting they were trying to be, it was incredibly uncomfortable for her. So since then, we were more mindful about that and would create just suggestions that, hey, maybe you could sit over here and keep your headphones on and kind of be close to me. So there was some physical regulation happening by being closer to me, where I could modulate that level of, I'm so happy I'm in recovery. I wasn't coming just beams blasting off of me. And so we would do things like that to help people have a little bit more modulated experience. Or eventually we were able to have separate spaces where there was one space that was known to be a more quiet space and more of a steady space. And I would direct them to sit there rather than the big lounge where there's all this happy, shiny recovery going on, because it's overwhelming. Yeah, it was a big learning point for me.
I often tell folks that when I was in college, I lived above, I think it was like 2 or 3 floors above our CRC for 3 years and never once took a foot inside because I was terrified of it. Because I was still kind of coming to terms with my family's relationship to addiction, what that meant for me as a student, but it meant so much to me that it was there.
Yeah.
And that alone, like, made me a super huge advocate. And again, now here I am doing the work that I do. But once I was then a graduate student, I felt like I had a voice as a student, and also I had some more kind of personal development. I created one. I work with people that I loved, and we created one. And yes, just the presence of a CRC can mean so much. And then also there's work you can do internally.
Yeah, just knowing it's there. Yeah, and I don't know about you in other areas of your life, but I know that for me in many different areas, but especially in my recovery, it would often be, I would know about something a year before I would engage in it. And that's okay. Like, that's all about stages of change, which we learn in motivational interviewing, right? It's like, I'm in preparation for a year. We know that stage is one of the longest. Like, yeah, okay, yeah, but not yet. What is it that tips that? One of the things that I know we were talking about at CU before I left was also taking collegiate recovery out of the center. Not only through outreach and tabling, which we were doing all of that, and people would engage with us, but going to specific populations on campus where we knew there was likely a higher barrier, that they would not necessarily come to us, and bringing a recovery talk. So we brought a recovery talks to at the time it was the GLBTQ Center, and now it's called the Gender and Sexuality Center. It might even be different now. We brought a recovery talks, a private closed recovery talks, to their center so that it could be in their safe space. So they didn't have to come. So I think that was one, I think that's actually really vital to get it out of the room. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, geez, again, I always appreciate your time and all the wisdom you just have and love for this work. We'll definitely have you back for sure if you want to come back. And yeah, I don't see any more questions in the chat or anything, but anybody who's not here currently will get the recording. So we may have some folks reach back out with questions. So I may forward you some questions via email, but
I'd be happy to answer those. Anyone hearing the recording right now, if you want to send questions or comments to Dylan, I would love to see them. Yeah, and can respond.
yeah, thank you to everyone who came and has been engaging in chat. Thank you so much, Sam. We'll be in touch for sure. So
thank you, Dylan. Thank you all. Yeah, wonderful.
thanks, everybody.
Oh, there's some other questions.